Oh crap, that's pretty fast. Okay. Okay. Come one, come all. It's time for some holiday cheer. Mihoyo has blessed us with its own Christmas miracle. Albedo has arrived, and is the first true split-stat 5-star we have in the game. Does this affect his potential? How do you best optimize him when he scales off 2 different stats? These are all questions I asked myself when I first started pulling for him, and now I have some answers, and feel it best to share. I'm Kleeful, and this is my first impressions and basic optimization breakdown of Albedo. No, not that Albedo. This one. So, who is Albedo? TLDR, Albedo is a 5-star Geo off-field DPS with support capabilities that has a surprisingly large versatility and capability, making him an excellent slot-in character for other teams. It's as simple as that. Now, the next question, how best to optimize or build him to excel in that type of role, is a question that I am better equipped to help answer. To start, we should go over his talents and constellations real quick, just to get them out of the way. For his talents, we have his inherent passive, which lets him supersede Mona as the go-to weapon enhancement alchemist. It has been mathed over at the Kaching Mains Discord, and he effectively has about 1% increased effectiveness over Mona, which is interesting. We have his A1, which lets his echoes do more damage to enemies who are below half health, which is nice. And his big claim to fame is his A4 passive, which grants his teammates 125 element mastery for 10 seconds. For his constellations, I'm going to start a rating system for constellations. I'm going to rate them using the normal gacha letter system, ranging from F to A and then going on to S and EX. In this scale, F is for failure, and completely ruins a character's capabilities or current use cases. The closest we have to this is Bennett's C6, which is the only E- constellation we currently have. It isn't quite F tier because it doesn't completely ruin him as a character, but it currently heavily impedes what he is capable of doing on a large variety of team compositions. X is more of a unique tier above S, reserved only for the largest buffs or the most significant gameplay changes given by an individual constellation. There are currently only 2 X-tier constellations in the game, and those are owned respectively by Child and Fischl, and they are both their C6s. To start off, Albedo's Constellation 1 provides him with a flat energy regen every time his transient bloom, blooms. This grants him a decent energy recharge boon, reducing his reliance on energy recharge as a stat when put on teams with lower energy generation rates. I'd give this a solid A rating. His Constellation 2 is the most useful of the bunch, giving his ultimate defense scaling. This heavily enables the defensive build, making it by far the most consistent way to build him. It is a solid damage increase that greatly reduces the performance hit he gets by being a split scaling character. A very strong S rating. His Constellation 3 boosts his E talent by 3, which further enhances the damage he can do both on and off the field. This would normally only be a B talent due to his split scaling, but with the more heavy reliance on defense from his previous Constellation 2 talent, we can bump it up a tier and call it a solid A. His C4 increases plunge damage for all characters within the radius of his solar isotoma. Plunge attack damage bonus is rare in the current cast of characters, and he does have an elevator to enable plunge attacks more readily in flat areas such as Abyss, but apart from its odd use to dodge away from a melee attack and then to plunge on the enemy to continue DPS, or to AoE a large group of enemies who happen to be surrounding you, its use is going to be relatively sparse. This puts it at a C rank. Constellation 5 increases his burst talent by 3. Not much to say, other than it gives a decent damage increase, but doesn't benefit as much as you might think because he already has Constellation 2, and that is also an ultimate damage buff, making him focus more on defense rather than attack. It's still a good upgrade though, but on the lower end of the B scale, so B-. C6 is in theory a very useful upgrade. It provides a damage boost when shielded by a crystallized shield, which is easy to obtain, considering his echoes are geo damage, which just constantly spew crystallized shields everywhere. The problem is, crystallized shields are weak, so they are very easy to lose, even with taking small hits from smaller enemies. And the 17% damage increase is additive rather than multiplicative, meaning it's not nearly as big as you might think. With current rough estimates on math, it comes out to approximately an average of about a 10% damage increase, which isn't the worst, but at the same time isn't quite all that amazing considering it's at his Constellation 6, which is typically where the creme de la creme sits. As such, it's going to get bumped down to a C- rating. Now that we have a general understanding of what Albedo's supplementary kit does, we should briefly go over what he actually does with his combat talents before we get into the actual build optimization. To start with, Albedo's normal attack chain is surprisingly stylish for something so simple, but that's where he starts to fall a bit short. The talent values aren't very large, and his attack speed later on into the combo chain isn't the highest, which really lets him down with a surprisingly low talent value per second. However, he does have one thing that lets him shine quite a bit. His charge attack is extremely spammable. We're talking ka-ching level spammable here. This allows him for some very respectable damage output, considering he has surprisingly good charge attack talent values. It's not necessarily comparable to ka-ching's, because ka-ching just has better values all around, but it does put him at a point where if you wanted to build him as a physical DPS or a on-field carry style character, you aren't taking a massive bullet so long as you are charge spamming when on field. His bread and butter is his skill Solar Isotoma. It's a very short cooldown turret that echoes your attacks every 2 seconds within its area of effect. Those echoes deal AoE geo damage. It has a neat little technique where if you trigger an echo as Albedo, you can immediately place the Solar Isotoma again and attack for another echo. This allows him to have a surprisingly respectable burst DPS in a short time window. Couple that with the fact his cooldown is only 3 seconds, and he fits surprisingly well in the role of a pivot character, who isn't necessarily your character, but is always the character you swap back to before you swap to someone else. Do note, the echoes scale off Albedo's defense, which is the second highest in the game, behind Chi-Chi, making them do quite a respectable amount of damage, both before and after investment. His burst, Tectonic Tide, functions as a wide AoE damage cone in front of him, dealing a decent chunk of AoE geo damage. It has a mechanic similar to Ningguang's, where if it is used while his skill construct is on the field, it spawns additional attacks. These additional attacks take the form of explosions that propagate in a wide area around the Isotoma. It may initially appear that all these explosions propagate based off pure RNG, but there does appear to be a mechanic in place that helps focus the explosions around areas of high enemy density. The more enemies in a small space, the more explosions will appear in that space. Note, this doesn't have a massive weight, but it is helpful at getting more than just 1 or 2 explosions on a small group of enemies. And now the moment I think we've all been waiting for, the Albedo number crunching. This is going to be a bit more of a ramble topic than everything else in the video, as I want to finish and get this out as soon as possible, as I'm kind of a bit already behind schedule, and I do want to cover as much as possible in about as short as time as I have. So to start, I'm not going to show the math of how I got to the fact that a geo damage goblet, and a crit hat is basically mandatory for him as a damage character, but at the same time those stats are already fairly standard amongst damage characters, so I hope you understand. The big story that we're going to focus on is what's the best hourglass for him, between attack and defense percent. Specifically, this will be explained a little farther in, but I want to first cover the elephant in the room about the substats. The big thing about the substats is I will reference attack percent or defense percent in the substats at least once throughout all of what we cover, and in that particular instance, their value is dependent on whether you are going for one playstyle or another. Having both is always going to be good and will be a damage increase. However, you typically will want to focus on one or the other depending on what style of build you are going for. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty numbers, I want to preface something about the substats beyond the defense versus attack argument. Normally, crit is mentioned as being very, very good and you want some of it, and you want a lot of it, but you typically aren't going all in on crit, because you want some attack percent, maybe you want a little bit of element mastery, maybe some energy recharge, so on and so forth. In this particular instance, for Albedo, crit is absolutely everything you want. Grab all of it. Albedo scales so much harder off crit than other units do, specifically because defense percent and attack percent have reduced effectiveness due to him being split scaling. Like I'm saying, grab all of the crit you can. There is no situation where you don't want crit. Now, specifically as to why exactly this is, I could go into a further explanation on the fact that crit doesn't really ever hit diminishing returns until you hit 100% crit chance, so long as you follow the general golden rule of trying to keep 2 crit damage to 1 crit chance. However, at the same time, that rule is taken a little too much for gospel in the community, and as such, I think I will be making a whole video a little bit later that'll be a little bit shorter, explaining all about crit, why it is considered king in most cases, on top of, you know, all the specifics as what the golden rule is, what does it mean for you, and how should you go about building around it. Either way, with that out of the way and the rant over, now it's time to focus on what we all came here for, the juicy numbers. First up, for all the numbers that I place on the screen, unless otherwise stated, they're going to be working on a Petra plus Gladiator set. This does not mean that Petra plus Gladiator is the best set to build on him. In truth, I actually don't think it is. I think end game scenario, you are either looking at a Petra plus Noblesse set or a Petra plus Gambler slash Defender set. Because funnily enough, with how high Albedo scales on defense in the long term for consistency, the reduction in base stats on Flower and Feather going to 4-star artifacts doesn't potentially cover the bonus you get from having such a good second set bonus. 30% defense is a lot. Even with defense artifact and some defense substats, you're still looking at like a 15 to 16% damage increase on everything that scales off defense. So if you have C2, it might just be best in slot, which is going to be interesting. But I digress. Now to start with, we're going to look at the single target scenarios because this both starts the entire trend that Albedo follows, as well as gives you a decent understanding of Albedo in a scenario where you're fighting one last thing in an abyss floor that you're trying to clear as quickly as possible, or you're fighting some of the bosses, or some other content in the future where you're only really hitting one thing at once. Also note, I'm just going to flash this on screen right now. These are the substats that I was using to obtain these numbers. They are pretty well peak optimized. They aren't perfectly rolled. We're talking about average rolls, but they're otherwise rolled perfectly into all the stats you do want. With a couple of flat stats because, of course, you're going to have 1 or 2 somewhere. As you can see on screen, there are 4 different damage categories. We have both Constellation 0 and Constellation 2, because Constellation 2 is the biggest breaking point for Albedo, as I believe I touched on earlier in this video, but it is the biggest breaking point for him in how you build him. But what you can see here is we have a few different key notable numbers. We have attack percent and defense percent damage, which is just using the exact same damage situation, but swapping Hourglass from attack percent to defense percent, not changing substats. The second thing you need to note is we have stuff here called 6TB/2FB or 4TB/3FB. These specifically are Transient Bursts and Fatal Bursts. These are the bursts that are spawned by his E and the bursts spawned by his Q, respectively. The reason I specifically picked 6 and 2 and then 4 and 3 is it is very, very consistent for you to get 2 Fatal Bursts, with a decent consistency of going instead for 3 Fatal Bursts on a single target. And getting 6 TB, or getting 6 Transient Bursts, is, though reasonable, not exactly the easiest thing to do, due to the fact that if you don't perfectly land an attack every 2 seconds, you aren't going to get 6 off before you can use your ult, if you're using it off cooldown. As such, we have gone both 6 E's with 2 Fatal Bursts and then 4 E attacks with 3 Fatal Bursts to explore the 2 polar opposite ends of single target, that being one that favors attack percent more and one that favors defense percent more. And then we copied the same thing over to Constellation 2 so that we can see how Constellation 2 affects that differential of numbers. The first thing of note that you might or might not be able to see here is the fact that Harbinger of Dawn, the 3-star weapon, if you can upkeep its passive, which means if you can upkeep your health above 90%, it is the best in slot weapon, which is absolutely ridiculous. A 3-star weapon is the best in slot weapon for a 5-star character. But some other notables are Black Cliff and Black Sword, because they are both crit weapons. Festering Desire is surprisingly good, and since it comes with an energy recharge main stat, or substat I guess, you aren't going to have to worry nearly as much about not ulting off cooldown, so there is some benefit there. Do note that Festering Desire and Harbinger of Dawn are both showcased with R5s, because Harbinger of Dawn is easy to R5, I mean very easy, and Festering Desire is free to R5, though we don't quite have it yet. We will be getting it as the event goes on. Now, the most important thing you need to notice here is the bold numbers, their percentages, differential. If that percentage is under 100%, it favors defense percent. If it is over 100%, it favors attack. And as we can see here, in Constellation 0, 4 Transient Bursts, 3 Fatal Bursts, it isn't until you get to the 5-star weapons that have the highest base attacks in the game do we actually break over to attack being higher than defense. And even then, we're talking like a percentage point here. It's nothing spectacular. So for single target purposes, defense percent is just best. I mean, sure, attack percent does work on 5-star weapons, but the 5-star weapons are worse than the 3-star weapon, which defense percent is better on. And the story goes even more in favor of defense once we move to Constellation 2, which winds up throwing even the most favorable of percentages of attack over defense on Aquila Favonia of 101.5% all the way down to 94.8%. So there's a huge gap there between the attack and the defense, which is understandable, and that's kind of the trend that C2 follows all the way through. Next, I want to showcase what happens once you start taking area of effect into consideration, because that is really where attack percent starts to make a case for itself as a burst support character. So the next sheet we're going to have up is going to be more simulated as a very, very nice situation. So we are getting 6 Transient Bursts, but we are also getting 5 Fatal Bursts. Now, specifically, in this scenario, not only are we getting 6 Transient Bursts and 5 Fatal Bursts, but every Transient Burst is hitting on average 2 enemies, and then your Fatal Bursts and your ultimate cast itself are hitting on average about 4 enemies each, which is typically a relatively reasonable scenario in a more mob-style situation. And here we can finally see that attack percent does start to make a name for itself. Harbinger of Dawn, the 3-star, is still the best in slot. The 5 stars are making a little bit more of a name for themselves in terms of being really, really good, especially Summit Shaper. And otherwise all the other weapons are sitting in and around where they were before. But the big thing is now we're looking at about a 2 to 5% difference of attack percent being better than defense percent, which it still isn't massive, but it's there, it exists. However, we move to Constellation 2, and even though the gap on Constellation 2 does narrow a bit over our previous graph, we're still at the highest percentage for attack percent, only at 95.65%. Doesn't really look good for C2. Now, we're going to look at a very extreme situation. Like I mentioned earlier, the ultimate has a mechanic in place that lets it focus on tightly knit groups of enemies a lot more than one might think if it was pure RNG. There has been footage shown of people getting large groups of mobs looking at 6, 7, 8 enemies all at once in a Venti ultimate, and casting Albedo's ultimate throws every single Fatal Burst into Venti's ultimate, hitting everything there. This is going to be the most extreme situation for attack percent. And so I figured I would come up with an extreme variant of the AoE version. So instead of doing 5 Fatal Bursts, we're doing 6 Fatal Bursts. And instead of them on average hitting 4 enemies, they're hitting 5 enemies. So we're giving a massive bonus to the ult side of things. And here we can see that yes, it does make a difference, but it's not nearly as big as we thought. In the previous graph, or in the previous dataset, we saw that Aquila Favonia had 106%, and it's always the most favorable for attack, because of how high its base attack is, and even then, that 106% doesn't even reach 110%. It will probably branch out to 112%-ish if we were getting 7 Fatal Bursts and we were hitting like 7 or 8 targets with all of them, but at the same time, there's also benefits there for you smacking more than 2 things with Transient Bursts, which we are still assuming you're only hitting 2 things on average with Transient Bursts. However, even with all of this ridiculous scaling, C2 still makes a case that defense is best. And there was no situation other than having 7, 8 things be hit all at once, or talking ridiculous talent levels, because I'm not going to show the graph, but I did calculations, and on C2, it takes talent level 13 for Aquila Favonia to hit 100%. And sorry, it's a little over 100%, it's like 100.01% or something. It was the difference between 745,000 and 744,000, which is a very minimal difference. And with these, we can infer a few key takeaways. Which brings me to the video's conclusion. If you have Constellation 2, build defense. There is no case to be made for anything else other than building defense. If you're Constellation 0 and want to have a no hassles, easy to play Albedo, then again, go defense. If you're looking to try and min-max yourself and only have Constellation 0, then depending on the content you're putting him through, yes, attack percent can make sense, but I still personally recommend going defense over attack. The numbers just don't lie. For weapon recommendations, first and foremost, I can heavily recommend Harbinger of Dawn, otherwise known as HOD. That's the 3-star I've been talking about. That's absolutely broken on him. It's just the best in slot for pure, unadulterated damage. Other than that, other good choices for weapons, you're looking at the Black Sword or Black Cliff for 4 stars. They both provide crit stats, which are heavily beneficial to Albedo and his kit. You also have Festering Desire if you want to use him less as an ult bot and more of just a official style turret, with the odd ult here and or there. It is very good at what it does. And then of course, if you have the 5-star weapons, Aquila Favonia works best for pivot. And with that, we've come to the end of the video. Make sure you guys hit that subscribe button and then click the bell so you get those notifications of when new videos go live. Make sure you also slap that like button. Any kind of user interaction at this stage heavily benefits the channel within the YouTube algorithm. I thank you all very much for watching.